Imagine you're fighting a jaguar 10 feet up off the ground in the middle of a jungle. Or imagine you're fighting one of the Three Musketeers in France. Or even, imagine you're helping to solve a murder in Britain. I have done all these things in theater. Theater has something for everyone, in my opinion. I am credible to speak about theater because I've been in theater for 5 years. I've been in 20 plus shows. I've done one community show. I'm in theater here at Grace, and I have even helped direct and lead some performances. The Anxiety and Depression Association of America says public speaking is said to be the biggest fear reported by American adults, topping flying, financial ruin, sickness, and even death. Today I will be discussing tips for auditioning to get over stage fright and some of what it is like to be in theater. In order to give you some tips for auditioning, I will start at the beginning. I will give you two first experiences in theater. My first experience was a show that my high school director wrote. I auditioned for it because I was in theater class, and it was one of the best experiences of my life. Then Anne Hathaway, a very famous actor, had very much the same start as me. She started in high school theater and eventually worked her way up to Broadway, and then obviously she's in movies now. What it took to get me to audition was theater class, friends pushing me. So people just kept telling me, hey Shannon, you should do theater, it's fun. Then my theater director invited me to audition, so I came and auditioned. What made me stay was, it's a whole new experience becoming another person in a theater environment. You really don't, it helps you understand new areas of life and new people that you wouldn't otherwise. Some advice for getting nervous when auditioning. The best advice that I ever got was jump off the cliff. One of the older people in my high school theater would always tell us to jump off the cliff, which means basically just go for it. Don't think about it, just go and give it your all. Never spend too much time thinking. The longer time you spend thinking during an audition, the less you're actually going to say. Trust your first reaction. In my experience in an audition, your first reaction is usually your best reaction. And never compare yourself to other actors. That'll just make you more nervous. Some more tips for auditioning is try to understand your character. Think about how your character would react in a certain situation. Think about your character's emotions during different stuff. Almost give them a personality. Remember to use like hand movements and facial expressions. It makes it a lot more boring if you're not using hand movements and facial expressions. And a lot of times that's a good way to stand out from other people. Don't be afraid to look stupid. That's the biggest thing about theater. If you feel like people are going to judge you when you're auditioning or anything like that, then most of the time you're going to miss out on opportunities to do something that impresses the judges. A very important thing to remember when auditioning is what you're getting into. You should ask yourself what type of show it is. Is it in the round, such as the wagon wheel? What in the round is the stage is literally in the middle of the audience and you're completely surrounded by the audience. Is it an improv show like Back in 5? Is it a musical? Why is this important? It helps you understand the show better so that you know what you're getting into. It can also help you be more prepared for an audition because obviously for a musical you're going to have to sing. For improv you'll have to be able to think on your feet very quickly, and in the round you have to be able to keep acting no matter what. Understanding what type of show you're auditioning for is great preparation and can spark many emotions. Understanding what show you're getting into is great for getting excited about it. Why is that good? Excitement is very important because, let's say I'm auditioning and I say a line, and I'll use one of my lines from the show that I'm in now at the school. So my line is, he's been a bit balshy with me, sir. So if I say it like that, it doesn't have much things. But if I'm like, he's been a bit balshy with me, sir, see, I have more excitement there, so it makes the line get across a lot better. It's also a lot more fun if you're excited about it than if you're all nervous and stuff, you're not going to have as much fun auditioning. And you also have a lot less bad stress because you're thinking more about the good things that are going to happen and you're thinking more positively. Once excited about a play, what can help more is if you dive into your character and the other characters more deeply. You should understand your character and their relationships with the other characters on stage. You need to understand a way that you can connect with this character. It is really important to build like a personal connection to your character, so like maybe a common hobby, or like if he gets angry about something you get angry about, or anything like that. Then also you want to understand your character's relationships with others. If there's someone that your character really like dislikes completely, or someone that he might have a little bit of a crush on, or someone that he sees as a father figure, you want to figure that out so that you can help build the play up better and help understand your character better. And it's really important to remember that the script doesn't tell you much, but it's okay to like go farther in depth in the script, and in fact most directors will encourage that. Once you understand your character, then you should start understanding the theme. Discover the theme. Every show has a theme. Look for things like reoccurring issues. Like typically every show, as in every book, has some kind of life lesson that you're supposed to learn from. And then also watch the major plot points and like see what's reoccurring throughout the entire show, and that'll help you understand the theme, and then understand the show better. A review of my main points. The 3 tips to remember for auditioning is jump off the cliff, hand motions and facial expressions, and then a few things to remember to help you understand theater is what type of show is it, understand the relationships, and discover the theme. Stella Adler, author of The Art of Acting, gives this advice. Tell yourself that the world is outside, that it's not to be hidden from you, that you are going to thrust yourself forward and be relaxed in the world.
64 in New York City. A 28-year-old woman is driving home from work to her apartment. She parks and gets out of her car. Suddenly, a man grabs her arm and she screams. Then she feels a searing pain in her side. She screams again. This is the story of Kitty Genovese, who was repeatedly attacked and eventually stabbed to death over a 45-minute period. 38 bystanders were aware that this was taking place, but no one intervened and no one called the police. If you were in chapel today, you know that Kitty's story illustrates a psychological phenomenon called the bystander effect. The Oxford Dictionary of Psychology defines it as the reluctance of bystanders to intervene in an emergency, especially when a large number of people are present. Psychologist Darley and Latine popularized Kitty's story with their idea of the bystander effect. They wrote that failure to intervene is due to the relationship among the bystanders rather than an attitude of disregard for the victim. At some point in their lives, everyone will witness an emergency. As college students and citizens, you need to know about the implications of the bystander effect so that you'll be better equipped to help someone in an emergency. My credibility comes from a research paper I did on this topic in high school, as well as additional hours of research for this speech. My information comes from a dictionary of psychology published by Oxford University Press, the article Group Inhibition of Bystander Intervention in Emergencies by Darley and Latine, and the article Recursive Mentalizing and Common Knowledge in the Bystander Effect by Kyle Thomas. So using these sources, I'm going to talk about the causes, effects, and solutions of the bystander effect. Once you've learned what causes the bystander effect, you'll have a better idea of why people are afraid to take action in an emergency. So there's 3 major factors that cause the bystander effect. The first is diffusion of responsibility. The Oxford Dictionary of Psychology defines it as a reduced sense of personal responsibility experienced by members of a group, often leading to behavior that's untypical of any of the group members who are alone. So So basically, the more people witness an emergency, the less likely they are to help. So you or I would normally help if we're alone, but because more people are present, we feel less responsible to do so. Darlene Lattine's original report on the bystander effect, which was published in the Journal of Personality and Psychology, they maintain that diffusion of responsibility was the main cause. But there's also two other factors that contribute. The second factor is pluralistic ignorance. In the article, The Bystander Effect, Reactions and Causes by Brandon Brodart, he explains this is the idea that you'll look to see how your friends respond before you determine your own reaction. So if your friends don't take action in an emergency, then you probably won't either. And basically, this is the idea of negative peer pressure. Because of others' inaction, an individual believes that their help is not needed, and they believe the lie that one person can make a difference. The third factor that causes the bystander effect is called strategic computation. Kyle Thomas, professor and chief scientist at Harvard University, conducted an experiment on responses to emergency situations. He found that an individual's decision to help depends on what they know about other bystanders who are present. He states that people will strategically shirk responsibility when they think others will feel compelled to help. So if one person has limited CPR knowledge and they know that no one else in the group knows CPR, then they'll probably be inclined to act. Whereas if they know someone is an EMT, then they won't do anything. So now that you know the three major causes behind the bystander effect, you can better understand their effects. The bystander effect causes people to be inactive or slow in taking action. And this can lead to negative consequences for both the victim and the bystander. Inaction or slow action can lead to severe injury or death for the victim, and it can also reduce the victim's chance of survival. In the newspaper article Bystander Effect, Why the Golden Hour is Lost, published on January 2016, doctors maintain that at least 50% of fatalities can be averted if victims are admitted to the hospital within the first hour. So after the first hour, their chance of survival greatly decreases. Inaction and slow action can also lead to regret for the bystander. It's better to know that you did all you could to help someone than regret not acting or not acting soon enough. So now that you know the causes and effects of the bystander effect, you can better understand possible solutions to the problem. So the first solution would be internal mentality. Instead of thinking about ourselves and what other people might think of us, it's better to think of what we can do to help someone else, and in the case, what you can do to help the victim. So there's also some action steps that you can take. You can decide to help and decide what kind of help is appropriate for the situation. And don't be afraid to communicate with others who are present. Like ask them, do you know CPR, or has anyone called 911? And finally, act immediately. Don't wait. So overall, we've talked about the motivations behind the bystander effect, which are diffusion of responsibility, pluralistic ignorance, and strategic computation. We've talked about the effects of the bystander effect, which is severe injury or death for the victim, and regret for the bystander. And we've talked about possible solutions to the bystander effect, which is to think of others above yourself and to take action quickly. Ultimately, if the bystanders had decided to help Kitty Genovese on March 13, 1964, she might have survived to enjoy a longer life. So let's decide to think of others above ourselves by helping in emergency situations. Let's decide to do our best by acting quickly. And let's decide, in the words of Gandhi, to be the change we wish to see in the world.
Imagine that it is the day before your final exam. You've been studying for 2 hours and it's midnight. All you want to do is go to bed, but you know you have a whole nother hour left before you feel ready for the exam. There's only one word I can think of to describe this situation, and it is stressful. We all face stress in our lives. It's a common problem that we don't think much about sometimes. According to Cooper and Palmer in How to Deal with Stress, they said that stress occurs when pressure exceeds your perceived ability to cope. So stress is when you feel overwhelmed and feel that you can't handle the circumstances that you are put in. This is relevant to each of us. We all face stress at one point or another in our lives, and probably we all face it on a daily basis. I have done probably 5 hours of research on this topic, and I found very reliable sources that I got my information from. The first was How to Deal with Stress by Palmer and Cooper, as I mentioned earlier. Also, Emotions, Stress, and Health by Alex J. Zatra. And finally, I looked at a study that Ruth Lowe did over 3 years, and she titled her study, A Longitudinal Study of Perceived Level of Stress, Coping and Self-Esteem of Undergraduate Nursing Students. So today I would like to discuss with all of you the causes of stress, the effects of stress, and finally, the solutions of stress. First, I would like to get into the causes of stress. According to Palmer and Cooper in How to Deal with Stress, everyone handles stress differently. It all comes down to what we view as either important or threatening. Take our schoolwork, for example. I'm sure we can all relate to schoolwork. It's a common problem in college. So if you view your schoolwork as important, then odds are that you will be stressed about it at times. However, if you don't think it's important or don't view the deadlines as threatening, you probably won't be worried about it and it won't be a source of stress for you. So as I said, important and threatening defines what stresses us out. So according to Ruth Lowe, in her study in 2002, she said 4 things that stress college students particularly. The first was academic. Our schooling affects our future, and so odds are you think your future is important, your job and everything with that. So academic is a very big source of stress. Also finances. If you feel that you cannot handle the debt you're going to face, that can definitely cause you anxiety. Also family. Everyone views family as important, I assume, or at least relationships. And if those aren't going well, then that can definitely be a source of stress in your life. And finally, health. If you aren't feeling well, you probably aren't going to be relaxed, and it is a very big source. So now that we have seen the causes of stress, let's look at the effects. There are 4 different areas I'm going to discuss about the effects of stress. The first is the heart. Surprisingly, we often think of stress just impacting our mind and just being a passing thing, but it can have lasting effects on us. And the first is high blood pressure related to the heart. That is a common problem, much more common than people realize. Also, in rare cases, heart attacks have been linked to stress, and stroke, as well as heart disease. In addition to heart issues, people often get mental illnesses as a result of stress. According to Zatra, in Emotions, Health, and Stress, depression often is a effect of stress. Another mental illness that is an effect is anxiety, which impacts many people. Another area of the body that is impacted is the immune system. Our body's immune system requires certain elements to fight pathogens, and stress decreases our body's ability to fight those pathogens and makes people more susceptible to sicknesses and disease. And finally, cancer, though it may sound surprising, is an effect of stress. it can be. It's not common, but it actually is one. So now that I have listed the causes and effects of stress, you probably want to hear one thing. What are the solutions to stress? The first solution was mentioned in Lowe's study with the college students. Time management was one thing that the college students reported as being successful in overcoming their stress. By better managing their time, kids were able to avoid procrastination. They had better planning, and therefore they felt that they were able to accomplish what they needed to do. As I said at the beginning, stress is when pressure exceeds your perceived ability to cope. So they felt that they could better cope with their situations by managing their time. Also, being aware of expectations increases the ability to cope and therefore is a solution to stress. For assignments at school, we often don't bother to read the syllabus, and so that can make that you aren't aware of the expectations and therefore you are stressed. But this increased awareness makes you feel capable of succeeding. The third solution to stress, Professor Lukens actually mentioned earlier in the year, and Cooper and Palmer also agreed: positive thinking. Our negative thoughts impact us much more than we believe. Negative thoughts are directly linked to causing stress, and so for every negative thought we have, we should combat it with multiple positive ones. This has been proven to help overcome stress. An example of this is if you think, I'll never be able to finish this assignment, then you should think to yourself, yes, I have time tomorrow at 3 p.m. I will be able to finish it. And that can help you feel more relaxed and be able to get it done. So, in conclusion, stress is a big impact on our lives. We have learned the causes of stress, the effects of stress, and also the solutions. Some of the causes were academic, family, money, and health. Some of the effects were on the heart, immune system, and mental illnesses. And finally, the best part, some of the solutions were time management, positive thinking, and realizing expectations. So I think it's pretty obvious that none of us want to live with stress, because according to an American proverb, living in worry leads to death in a hurry.
While trying to find a church and catching rides with some of my friends to their churches, I realized that something very important was missing, and that was community. As I realized that the community was missing from this church, I decided to ask 8 of the people that I went to church with what they valued most in looking for a church, and these are the results. So I visited 4 churches. One of them I'm going to leave out because overall it wasn't my favorite, but 3 of them made a lasting impact on me. The first church, we are going to call this the Too Hot Church. Now this church was extremely social media oriented and completely overlooking the people factor of their community. Now the 3 people that I went to church with ranked in their list of things that were most important. The first person said community, the second person said biblical message, and the third person said a welcoming community. Now 2 of these 3 people said community, but they have chosen to stay at a church that has little to no community. Now the second church is the Too Cold Church. Now this church, as soon as I walked in, everybody is sitting down by themselves playing on their phones. And it was so disappointing. Nobody was talking with each other or anything. So I decided to talk to the 3 people that I went to church with. The first person said they looked for a place where they could be used by Christ. The second person said they looked for a good community, and the third person said they focused on the quality of the music. Now one of those people said community, but they have chosen to go to a church with no community. Now the third church, and the church that was my favorite and I'm continuing to go to, is called the Just Right Church. Now this church, as soon as you walk in, nobody's sitting down, they're fellowshipping with each other and building their community and getting to know each other. And the 2 people that I talked to about the church the people that I wrote with, they said that they were looking for community and fellowship through community. And I think we found the right place because the fellowship in this church was amazing. I believe that as a college student, finding a good church is very important. And finding a church is hard, but that doesn't mean you should settle. Now I realize that there are a lot of good churches in the area, and I've only been to 4 of them, so don't take this as me trying to tear down your church, but I hope it gives you a few things to look for in your church concerning community. There should be 3 things, in my opinion, that you should look for in a church, and they are as follows. 1, a solid doctrinal statement that can be found usually on the church website, just to see if they follow through what they say they believe in. The second is good, well-spoken Christ followers, such as the leaders of the church or the pastor. Somebody that shows that they're continuing to grow in Christ and show the fruits of the Spirit and are continuing to grow in their faith. And thirdly, a Christ-centered, welcoming community with ways to get involved. For me personally, as being, I spent 10 years of my life as a member of Calvary Baptist Church in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, being involved in many of the ministry opportunities such as middle school ministry, Tots Church, praise band, youth group, and Awana. So I think I'm very credible to talk about this with being a huge part of my church community. My information that I have found, the first one was from an encyclopedia article written by Michael McClaman, wrote this year about the definition of the church body. The second is a journal entry entitled Where 2 or 3 Are Gathered, the Church as a Praying Community, written by Dr. Robert Ellis, a professor of theology at the University of Oxford. The third is quotes from the book Everybody's Normal Till You Get to Know Them, written by John Ortberg. He has written 5 other books and is the pastor of Malone Park Presbyterian Church, and finally many verses from the Bible. So I will be talking about the reasons why community is important, not just as a college student, but through your whole life. How you can find community and see if your church has a good community. And lastly, what does God say about community? So now that I've told you what I'm going to be talking about, this is the information that I have found. So first, in Romans 12:4-5, it says, "For in the body we all have many members, and the members do not have the same function. So we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individual members one of another." So in the body of Christ, we all have different responsibilities and different spiritual gifts. And I think a good community really gives you the opportunity to use your gifts to further other people's relationship with Christ. My second point is McLaughlin's definition of the body of Christ. His definition is a community of believers that show a relationship between Jesus and each other. So not only is the body of Christ, the community, supposed to be together with Christ, but we're supposed to build each other up as well. Which brings me to my last point. 1 John 6-7 says, "If we say we have fellowship with him, but we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus cleanses us from all sin." God calls us to walk alongside him, but we can't do that by ourselves. We need not only a college community, but a church community to help build us up towards that end goal. And to help us when we fall and keep us accountable. Because I think everybody in this room, we at least have one person that can keep us accountable and that we tell things to. And my last point, Ortberg says in his book, Everybody's Normal Till You Get to Know Them, one mark that distinguishes a healthy church from an unhealthy church is authentic community. Now, authentic means true, genuine, and real. But what is a real community? Because you need to know that before you can find it. Here are 4 things a true community has, and disclaimer, not every church is perfect. Romans 4:1-12. I recommend that you read this because it gives a good example of how we are supposed to treat other people in the church that worship differently than us. In my opinion, being open to other people's forms of worship is good. A real church community does not discriminate people for if they want to raise their hands while they sing, or if they prefer not to pray out loud. A good community, second point, a good community shows God's love to all and does not judge by race, age, or gender, because everyone was The third point, fellowship with one another before and after church. When I was getting to know my roommate that I have now, I was telling her about my church back home, and she was just amazed that I was so close with other people in my church because she didn't have that. And that was very disappointing to see that her church had failed her like that. And then my fourth point in Matthew 18:20 says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am also." Dr. Robert Ellis's journal talks about this subject. Now, this is my words paraphrasing this huge journal. So he says, "For God himself does not show up in the flesh, but he can be seen through others in the church by the way we act and by the way we love." So I think that's a good example of community. We should be able to see Christ's love shown through others to the other people in the church and also the community around the church. Now, what does God say about community? In 1 John 4:11 says, "Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another." God calls us to love one another, but do we really try to love others if we don't even try to talk to the other people in our church while we learn about how to love others? Now, I'm just going to run through everything real quickly. The first point was community is very important. It is a very important part of the church. Second, it's not very hard to find. And 3, God does call us to community. Now, college is very stressful, but a good church family will help you grow closer to Christ and encourage you through your years at college.
How many of you would say you're different from the person next to you? In any way, shape, or form? Okay. By looking at the hands around you, you can see we're all different. We're all different heights, different hair color, different shoe size, everything. God has made us all different. And today, I'm going to talk about the importance of special education and how they deal with the different types of people. So, as you all know, our educational system in America has several different areas. From special ed to regular, just normal classes that everyone gets to take, all the way up to college credit classes in high school. And so that's very important. Today, so where I got my sources are from, one, I'm in an education class, like talking about the importance of special ed, and so that's like the big thing. So today I'm going to talk about the history and the background of special education in America. Then I will talk about the different types we have, and then the importance of it. So it all started in the late 1600s when people started to realize that the people around them were different, that they learned different, that they acted differently than they did, and they didn't know how to respond to it. So they just gathered up all the people who they thought were different, and they put them in asylums and institutions and just left them there to be. They didn't really know what to do. And so as time goes on, a group in Europe decided, well, these people are different. Why should we treat them different when they're basically us? There's just a little off. So why don't we treat them normally and see how that works? So they got together and they actually got the people around them to change their core beliefs. And so they decided, instead of isolating them in asylums, we'll bring them back into schools and give them their own classroom and let others come interact with them. And so in the 1600s, Ponce de Leon created the first class, the first special education class in his school. And it was for people who were blind. So, by then, they started to form laws in different classes, and in the 1900s, France was the first to establish a law saying that if you had a disability, that you were automatically allowed into a school. You couldn't be rejected from the school just because you had a disability. And that really changed because it sparked a movement, and it created the created the Council for Exceptional Learners, which in America today makes up a lot of the school system just because there are so many students with disabilities. And the disabilities in special education classrooms they're over 15. And the top 3 are autism, dyslexia, and intellectual disability, which is basically mental retardation. And those are the top 3 because they're the most seen. Autism makes up 3% of the whole world population has autism, and so it's like, even though it doesn't seem like a lot, that really is a lot. And that really affects everyone. Like, whoever has it has problems with communication, social skills, and they're really repetitive. And so back in the old days when they saw this, they just thought you were crazy and you would be isolated, and sometimes they even were put to death for it. And dyslexia is a big one because it makes up 80% of the population, and people don't even realize that if you have it, you know you have it, but the people around you can't even see you have it, and so it's really big. So the history. So as I'm coming to a close, the history is, it's always been around. It's always been here, we've always had it, and there's nothing we can change. And there's so many different types, we all know, like, there's so many, it's hard to comprehend all the different ones and how to deal with everything. But in today's world, we're doing such a better job at realizing it and taking better control of it. And then the impact it has built, in today's world we have built so many things up for special education, and it's just getting better and better. And we've come to realize and accepted that special ed kids and regular kids have and should have the same rights and educational goals throughout, no matter what they have. And so to end, there's a Bible verse, Romans 12:6. God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. So if God has given you the ability to prosper, speak out with as much faith as God has given you. If your gift is serving others, serve them well. So we're all different, and even if you have a disability or know someone who has a disability, they're spreading their gift. God gave them that gift, and they're impacting the lives of others just by having that. And it's incredible to see that, and it's also incredible for me to be learning how to teach people with that gift and spreading my gift and learning about theirs.
November 22nd, 1963, Dallas, Texas. A day that changed the course of a nation. President John F. Kennedy was riding in a presidential motorcade with the governor of Texas and their respective wives. As they turn onto Dealey Plaza, a shot rings out from the direction of a grassy knoll. Two more bullets follow, and 2 of the 3 bullets strike President Kennedy, with the second delivering the fatal blow. Lee Harvey Oswald has just started the beginning of an era with his assassination of President John F. Kennedy. According to Tom Brokaw, iconic news anchor and author of the book Boom, talking about the 60s, November 22nd, 1963 was the beginning of the 60s era and launched a generation to do things different than their predecessors, the greatest generation. When I look at the current state of our nation and our culture, I see a lot of similarities to the 60s. There are a lot of different movements going on within people, and the minds of people are changing. The minds of the youth are very different from the minds of the generation before us, and I just see a lot of similarities between them. I'm a huge fan of history, and the 60s are my favorite era, and I've studied them a lot since my junior year when I read the book Boom in my junior history class. So my information comes from the book The World the 60s Made, Politics and Culture in Recent America by Van Goss and Richard Moser. the book Countercultures and Popular Music by Sheila Whiteley and Jedediah Flower, the book America's Uncivil Wars, the 60s Era, From Elvis to the Fall of Richard Nixon by Mark Lytle, and the book Boom, Talking About the 60s, What Happened, How It Happened, How It Shaped Today, and Lessons for Tomorrow by Tom Brokaw. I'm going to talk about three main things from the 60s: music, politics, and civil rights. One of the biggest and first impacts of the 60s was that of music. The style changed dramatically, as well as the message. The first big band to burst onto the scene in 1963 was the Beatles. They flew over from Britain to America and were on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was a huge deal for artists in the 60s and 50s. They had a successful show on the Ed Sullivan Show, and America fell in love, and they started the British invasion. Their style was different from a lot of bands at the time, and everybody loved it. And then other bands followed with the British invasion thereafter, like the Rolling Stones. But in the mid-60s, the Beatles changed. According to Sheila Whiteley, author of the recent 2014 book Countercultures and Popular Music, the Beatles changed their style greatly in the mid-60s and were capable of doing almost anything, which caused much more diversity in music overall, especially influencing in the 1970s. They started having a lot of political messages in their speech, and they also got into drugs and LSD, which really changed the content of their songs. They were very messed up, and their album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band was the iconic song of the summer of 1968, which is also dubbed the Summer of Love, which was the height of the hippie and countercultural movements. Another influential musician was Bob Dylan. He brought folk music onto the scene, and also had some political undertones in his songs. But at the Newport Jazz Festival one year, which was a huge jazz and folk music gathering, he used electric guitar, and that caused a big riot. But after that, he ended up writing the song Like a Rolling Stone, and it was a huge hit, and it was one of the greatest songs of all time. You may have heard a little bit about Dylan the past few weeks, because he was recently given the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he was the first ever musician to do so. Other influential musicians of the 60s include Simon and Garfunkel, a folk duo with songs like The Sound of Silence and The Boxer. Jimi Hendrix, who is a legendary guitarist. The Beach Boys, who started the surf genre of music and were very successful in bringing that onto the scene. And the Grateful Dead, who were a big part of the countercultural and hippie movement of the 60s. There are a lot of the musicians of the 60s focused on politics and how to change the world. And I think I see a lot of things like that in current music. Trends are changing, and they're getting very political. The music of the 60s era was revolutionary and had a very political themes woven throughout, which helped get the youth of America involved in politics in the 60s. In the 60s, there were a lot of atypical candidates. The first was a 1964 Republican nominee for president, Barry Goldwater. According to Van Goss, author of The World the 60s Made, he wrote in 2003, the modern conservative movement began with Goldwater, and it gained steam in the years following. Although he only won 52 electoral votes in the 64 election, he was very influential in the policies of Ronald Reagan, who would run for president a couple years later and fail, but he would eventually become president, which was the apex of the conservative movement. Then there was George Wallace. He ran for the Democratic nomination in 1968 as a segregationist. He ended up losing the nomination, but he ran as a third party with the American Independent Party and won 46 electoral votes from the South. It was just a really odd thing to have a segregationist running for president. Then also in 68, there was a Democratic challenger named Eugene McCarthy. He was an anti-war candidate and was the first major party candidate to come out against the Vietnam War. So college students across the country loved Eugene McCarthy. His campaign slogan was "Clean for Gene." There were other important people like Ronald Reagan, who was an actor turned politician and would be a very big conservative leader. And then there was Robert F. Kennedy, who was the brother of John F. Kennedy. He was leading the race for the 1968 Democratic nomination, but after the California primary, he won and was giving a speech, and afterwards he was assassinated by a man named Sirhan Sirhan. In there were two presidents of the 60s era. The first was Lyndon B. Johnson, who took over after JFK was assassinated. He was inaugurated on Air Force One on the way back to the White House. And then there was also Richard Nixon, who won the 68 election and won in a landslide in 72 with 520 electoral votes while only losing one state. But unfortunately, he was much more known for the Watergate scandal that really shaped the beginning of the 70s and helped the 60s come to a close. There are a lot of similarities between politics there and today. Certain candidates, they're undergoing a big political shift today, and that happened in the 60s. Politics was a very important outlet for the youth of the 60s, but civil rights also provided a platform for many more youth and college students to get involved. Of course, there's Martin Luther King Jr. According to Mark Lytle, author of the 2006 book, America's Uncivil Wars, the 60s Era, From Elvis to the Fall of Richard Nixon, Martin Luther King was very influential with his peaceful methods, but some still labeled him an extremist. In 1963, he had his March on Washington and gave his I Have a Dream speech. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee by James Earl Ray. In contrast with Martin Luther King, there was Malcolm X. He had more violent methods to his agenda and preached black supremacy. He was also assassinated in 1965 in New York. There was some key legislation passed for civil rights: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There are a lot of parallels with today, with the Black Lives Matter movement being a big civil rights movement, and they take methods from both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. So music, politics, and civil rights from the 60s were very prevalent in the culture, and they're still influencing us today. The 60s ended with the resignation of Richard Nixon and the fall of Saigon, which ended Vietnam in 1974 and 1975. There's a song that is really a symbol of the 60s to me. It was written by John Lennon after the Beatles broke up in 1971. The words were, "You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one."
On the night of May 22nd, 2000, rebels with the Lord's Resistance Army invaded our home. There was no time to run. There was 5 men, and one specifically attacked me. He held me down, he tied me up, and he ripped my blouse off. I watched them beat my mother from afar, and I couldn't do anything about it. I thought that they were going to kill me, but instead, they made me kill others. I was 10 years old when I was married against my will. The first time he forced me to have sex, I cried and I bled a lot. He demanded sex every day. If I resisted, then he beat me, sometimes to the point of paralysis. I felt so weak at times because I had no food and no water, but I had to go to him anyway. What mindset are you in right now? Conti was a victim of sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is a modern form of slavery in which someone deceives another person into commercial sexual exploitation for profit. Any child sold for sex is considered a victim of sex trafficking by nature of age. Simply, sexual violence is a business. Why do you need to know this? Sex trafficking is more than just violence and threats and rape, but sex trafficking is violent slavery, it's bondage, it's a mind game. Sometimes it's just a way of living, and sometimes this is a way people financially support their family. Why should you care? Because sex trafficking is within your country today, and more than half of you in here are at risk for being victims. Why should you believe what I say? I've done many reports on sex trafficking, and I worked against and took steps to abolish sex trafficking for a year in 2014 by financially donating to International Justice Mission, or IJM. IJM is a human rights organization that rescues victims of violence, sexual exploitation, and slavery. My information comes from the article Sexual Trafficking in the U.S. by David R. Hodge. The article Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking in the U.S. by Kimberly Coltra. The book Confronting Commercial Sexual Exploitation and Sexual Trafficking
of minors in the U.S. by the National Research Council. I also used information from the official website of IJM, or International Justice Mission, and personal stories from Equal to Now. What I'm going to be talking about today is facts on sex trafficking within the United States, and how to come behind to defend the victims of sex trafficking. After hearing a personal story of a sex trafficking victim, I hope I have you on your toes to learn more and gain more knowledge and interest on such a touchy subject. An estimated of about 17,500 foreign nationals are trafficked annually in the United States, and about 200,000 American children are at high risk for trafficking into the sex industry each year. U.S. children are being sold not only on the streets by their pimps, but also via Craigslist and truck stops across the nation. If people didn't desire to have sex with children, sex trafficking wouldn't be a thing. Kimberly Colcha, an assistant professor at Baylor University, states, "It is important to recognize the trafficking of thousands of American children for commercial sexual exploitation would not exist if demand for them were not present." The U.S. has their own definition of sex trafficking. This is sad because they refer to their own people as anything with value, not just someone with value. The United States government defines sex trafficking as recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining a person for purposes of sexual commercial act. A commercial sexual act is defined as any sex act in which anything of value is received or given by a person. Those trafficked tend to have little control of the sexual acts that they are required to perform in by their pimps or by their buyers. David Hodge, a social worker and assistant professor, states, "Young women may be forced to engage in abusive and degrading sexual acts. For example, women may be whipped and then urinated on. Children may be handcuffed and compelled to have sex with dogs and then eat out of their dog bowls and drink out of toilets. This is happening within your country." Now that you know sex trafficking is amongst us today in our own country, maybe you have an interest in coming behind to support the appalling torture of sex trafficking. Ways that you can do this is serving the victims and survivors of sexual exploitation. You can financially donate to organizations. The National Research Council explains most current prevention efforts focus on raising awareness of the problem of commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking of minors and improving capacity to identify children and adolescents at risk for victimization. Other organizations' prevention work is aimed primarily at assisting and supporting those at risk for commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. Lastly, you could pray. I feel like a lot of us believers sometimes forget the power of prayer and what that can actually do to change. Matthew 21:22 says, "And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith." Having faith in prayer is the main point in prayer. In conclusion, we've discussed facts about sex trafficking within the United States, and how to come behind sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is a form of modern slavery in which someone deceives another person into commercial sexual exploitation for profit. The ending of Kansi's story isn't so bad after all. She says, "I heard about the Child Voice International. Since then, my life has been changed. I'm a different person now. During my time there, I learned English and chores like cooking, but I didn't count it as a chore. I also found a relationship in Jesus. After leaving Child Voice, I found work in a bakery. I met my current husband there, and unlike my first husband, he is good to me and he treats me as an equal. For the first time in my life, I have hope for my future and I have hope for my children's future. Today, I believe I can do many good things if I find the work in it, if I find a way. I am much happier now and I can even laugh sometimes." Thank you.
A stockbroker employed by a major brokerage firm drives into the city late on a Saturday afternoon for takeout at a local restaurant. He chooses the particular restaurant because he is soliciting the owner as a potential client, and while en route, he decides to make phone calls to prospective and current clients on his cell phone. When he reaches for the phone, the cord becomes entangled in the stick shift of his red Mercedes convertible, and the phone slides out of his hand and onto the floor. He claims he takes his eyes off the road to pick up the phone, and while doing so, he runs a red light. He strikes and kills a father of 3, who's on a motorcycle driving home from a convenience store where he has just picked up a package of hot dogs for the family dinner. This excerpt is from a legal article written by Thomas Dinklacker, a Pennsylvania attorney. Today, we hear far too many stories similar to this one, and they always hit home because of the dangerous truth that lies within it, that all of us are only one moment away from losing our lives or taking someone else's because of the simple misuse of a cell phone. The abilities and dangers that cell phones present are an extremely important topic to discuss in our society because an overwhelming amount of our population has their own cell phone that they use every day and overuse every single day. Because the majority of us have cell phones, I strongly believe that the potential dangers of cell phones should be learned about and discussed more often. It is crucial that we as people learn to control our technology and not let it control us, especially cell phones. I'm credible to discuss this topic because I spent hours of research and I have also had over 7 years of experience with my own cell phone. There are 2 major points I want to address with the duration of my time. One is the history of different technology that led to cell phones, such as the telegraph, the wired telephone, and the actual development of the cell phone. Another important point is the danger of driving while using a cell phone. As we dive in, I believe that it's vital to learn about the history of different technologies so we can understand how cell phones developed in our culture in the United States. Jairus Hansen, an experienced author and professor of communications at the University of Massachusetts, wrote an excellent book titled 24/7, How Cell Phones and the Internet Changed the Way We Live, Work, and Play, which is where the history of technology, including the cell phone, will be taken from for my speech. In the 1830s, the most innovative technology to date was being created in the telegraph. The invention received a lot of credit because of Samuel Morse, who developed an efficient messaging language of dots and dashes, which we all know as Morse code. The telegraph soared because of its use in a war in Cuba in the year 1897. The first telegraph communication occurred at this time and made it easier for soldiers from far away to communicate about strategy from country to country. Also, the growth of the telegraph helped the United States learn new ideas of many areas of life so we could develop our nation further. Although the telegraph was developed before the wired telephone became known more immediately to the world than the telegraph did it initially. Alexander Graham Bell patented the telephone in 1876, and when this invention became well known to the public, the United States' expectations and beliefs for our future inventions were vast. Bell's invention in the telephone inspired ideas that later would come to fruition and highly surpassed the initial expectations of many people in the United States. The abilities of cell phones, with a seemingly short history, have actually been around longer than many of us could think. Messages over telephone were able to be executed as early as 1909, and wireless phones were available in 1947. But due to high costs and the lack of a profitable market, the commercial cell phone was not introduced until the year 1984. Motorola, a technological company that we're all familiar with, played a huge part in developing cell phones. The company invested over $100 million from the 1960s to the 1980s, and they aided the creation that we now know as cell phones. Now that a base of history is understood about the cell phone and technology that led up to it, we can begin to learn more about the dangers they present when driving a vehicle. David Ropeek and George Gray, co-authors of the article Cell Phones and Driving, How Risky, help individuals realize some of the dangers that cell phones present while driving. Ropeek, an international consultant, and Gray, an experienced professor of a number of universities, use many helpful statistics of this topic that I will share. The number of individuals that admit to using a cell phone while driving, at least sometimes, is astounding, lying between 80 and 90%, and 30% of these individuals, at least, confess to regularly using their cell phone while driving. On the same token, anywhere from 40 to 70% of mobile calls taken in the U.S. come from someone behind the wheel. These numbers frighten me, and I'm not putting blame on others because I too am guilty of using my cell phone behind the wheel almost every day. Many drivers that use their phones, including myself, believe they've developed some sort of skill in doing this, but we fail to realize the ways that we are impaired and the severity of the impairments that come over us. Obviously, the first impairment is a visual impairment. When deciding to use your cell phone, you completely take both your eyes off of the wheel, or off of the road, and you are focused with one hand on your phone and one hand on the wheel. And there is no such thing as multitasking. All of your attention is either on the phone or on the road. You can switch quickly, but there's no such thing as doing both at the same time. Another impairment is that of biomechanical. When you're using a cell phone, like I said, you're using one hand, at least one hand, to look at it, or type, or look at a contact, or look at a message, and you're using the other to control over a ton of steel. And you're on the road, and when you only have one hand to do so, it can be dangerous when you slip on ice, or when someone cuts in front of you, or anything else terrible happens. You lose over 50% of control when you decide to use your phone and use your car with the other hand. The last impairment is a tad tougher to understand, but it is that of cognitive impairment. When you have phone conversations, when you're listening to your girlfriend rant on and on about something that's been going on all day, or you're trying to tell a story, or you're trying to read a text, or read a story, or sometimes people even play games on the road, your focus is completely off of what you're doing. Even when having a normal conversation and looking at the road, your mind is somewhere else, and you're not in a state to drive safely. I'm very impressed with Ropeek and Gray's article because, although simple, they provide driving tips for individuals who have a cell phone and are involved in the process of driving. And these tips are very practical and helpful for those who drive and use their phones, unfortunately. Of them include two great tips that I like. One of them is just keep the calls short. Leave them to 1 or 2 minutes so you're not focused on something else besides the road. Keep them short to tell your mom that you're going to be home for dinner, and get going quickly with your calls and then hang up. If you decide to use your cell phone, avoid difficult maneuvers in the process, such as accelerating quickly or cutting across lanes or swerving quickly. In conclusion, it can be agreed upon that cell phones are one of the greatest inventions of our time and are still being adapted. However, it is crucial to understand as young people and millennials that cell phones can take over our lives if we're not careful to make sure that we control them. I believe it's been very beneficial to learn the history of the cell phone and technologies leading up to it to see how much progress has been made and where we're headed. Additionally, it's crucial to know the dangers of driving when phones are involved so we can save ourselves and save others. As stated previously, cell phones have surpassed the expectations of so many people. However, that observation should not consume us. My challenge to all of you would be to use your cell phone wisely and to use your time wisely and spend time with people. Whenever you're not using your phone, it's time well spent, and there's nothing better than those experiences. Thank you.
Artists sign their most prized possessions. They sign the work that they are so proud of that they created. They sign their masterpieces. They're not going to sign something that they are not proud of or don't find any worth in. Our bodies are masterpieces. God created our bodies to perfectly function within itself. Scientists are finding more and more interesting and fascinating details about the way our bodies function. But this shouldn't surprise us. Genesis 1 tells us that God created us in His image. And God is perfect. His whole being is perfect. So it would make sense that if we are created in His image, that our bodies were made to function perfectly. One fascinating thing about our bodies is this little thing called laminin. Laminin is a protein inside of our bodies that's a part of our extracellular matrix. It holds our cells in place inside of our organs. It forms a wall that wraps itself around the cells and the organs and holds them in place. Without it, our organs, the stomach for example, would be a blob of cells inside of our body instead of an effective organ that digests our food. I first learned about laminin 6 years ago in youth group, and it fascinated me. I couldn't stop thinking about this little tiny protein inside of our body, and I've studied it ever since. Through articles in the Morgan Library database, I have learned more and more about laminin. The most helpful articles that I found were written by men such as Kiki Hall, who actually helped discover laminin, M.L. Tanzer, who graduated from Harvard Medical School with his doctorate, so he understands the intricate being of our bodies. He understands the function of how it works. N.B. Hanumanthipa, who wrote a peer review article on progeria, which I will get back to later. Whenever you learn about something new, you must understand how it came to be, and the structure and the function, the abnormalities of it, and its shape. According to Hall's article, he and Rupert Temple discovered laminin in 1979. This is a very recent discovery. Both Hall and Tanzer, who was the medical student who graduated from Harvard with his degree, confirmed that laminin is made of 3 parts: the A chain, the B1 chain, and the B2 chain. The A chain is a long chain, and the 2 B chains are short and connect to the A chain. This results in a very unique shape, which I'll talk about at the end of my speech. Remember how I said that laminin binds itself together and forms a wall that holds our organs together? Well, unfortunately, we live in a very fallen world, and sometimes laminin does not function the way that God intended it to. Some people have deficiencies within laminin, causing the organs to not work properly. Hanumanthipa wrote on the rare abnormality called progeria. Progeria is the mutation of laminin A gene, which is the long chain. Essentially, it is a premature aging syndrome. This is a very, very rare syndrome, but it's very fatal in children. And that's who gets it. It's just in children. Around the world, there are 134 children who are diagnosed with this disease. There is no proven cure, but there is medicine to help slow down the destructiveness of it. It is so destructive that it results in death in children in their late teens and early 20s. Another disease is nephrotic syndrome, which essentially is kidney disease. Protein is lost through the kidneys because the kidney filter is not working properly due to the defect of laminin. So as you can see by these examples, with laminin not working properly, bad things happen. It's amazing how this little protein inside of our bodies can do such destruction if it's not working correctly. So you might be wondering, why does this fascinate you? Well, it's the shape. The shape is what fascinates me. Shape isn't usually as important as the function, but in this case, it is. This is the shape of laminin. There are 3 chains: the A chain, the B1 chain, and the B2 chain, as I mentioned earlier. It's in the shape of a cross. I don't believe in coincidences. I believe that God gave us laminin to hold our bodies together, just as He holds us together. Corinthians 1:17 says, Christ is before all things, and in him all things hold together. This is like his signature in us. But you might be wondering, does laminate prove that God created us? Well, no. Laminate doesn't prove that God created us. I believe that God created us because that's what the Bible tells us. He loves us and created us because it tells us in Genesis 1:27, which says that God created man and woman in his image. And then in John 3:16, it says how much God loves us, that he would send his only son to die for us. But isn't it so like God to put something so unique in us to prove to us that he loves us? He could have created this little protein that holds our body together in any shape he wanted, but he chose a cross, the symbol of love and the Christian faith. God deliberately designed the structure, the function, the abnormalities, the shape in such a unique way to show us how much he loved us. Just as an artist signs his masterpieces, so does God sign us. And he signs us with love. God was so proud of this masterpiece that he made me in his image and he signed me with love. And God was so proud of the masterpiece he created in each one of you that he signed you with a little protein called laminate.